Well, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to another Sabbath service with After's Heart Ministries. I do have a statement that I'm going to make, and it's a kind of a nasty one. Everything that you have understood about evangelism has actually been a mind control psyop. So that was a pretty bold statement to make, and I could tell you that this particular message, I wasn't sure if I was going to preach it because I didn't have any confirmations, and I was getting concerned that maybe it was my own imagination and that it wasn't going to be a continuation of the reality series. And then I had some Neum time early this morning, and I realized the reason why I didn't have confirmations is because this is actually connected to another part of this message. So I don't know if this is going to be two parts or not, but I can tell you that what we are about to get into is actually going to blow your mind. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. First and foremost, what we're going to do is we're going to look up a very specific verse. And I'm going to use the Blue Letter Bible. And as is usually customary for me, I will do the search right on the video with you guys. But very specifically, I am looking for references to hell, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into that here. All right, so now we are jumping into hell. And I'm just going to lock this search into New Testament only. And very specifically, I am looking for the discussion between Yeshua and the Pharisees, where they have this discussion about them making disciples. Okay. So one of the things I want to do, first of all, let's take a look at this verse side by side. So we'll put it in the NLT on one side, and we'll put it in the Young's Living Translation on the other side. So in the NLT version, it says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell that you yourselves are." And in the Greek, of course, it says Gehenna. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, on the other side, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go around the sea and the dry land to make one proselyte, and then whenever it may happen, ye make him a son of Gehenna twofold more than yourselves." Wow, that's a lot of stuff there. Let's just really quick talk about the Pharisees, okay? So first of all, it is very important to know that when the Babylonian exiles came back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the wall, rebuilt Jerusalem, and started occupying Israel again, that there was really not ever a release from Persia. So when Greece takes over the Persian Empire, and it's specifically the Levant, it's specifically the Middle Eastern part of the continent of Asia, there is a function of disconnect from the liberation that people perceive that it was in their minds. Now, the reason why I say that is because in general, there really never was a freedom. There was never really a liberty. There was a permission to return to their own land, and there was an opportunity to occupy the place that they once lived. But truth be told is that was only the tribe of Judah and not the Israelites. And furthermore, now, and this is important, there never was a non-Gentile occupation of Israel from the moment that Nebuchadnezzar walked into the land of Israel until now. Now, I know that sounds pretty asinine because, of course, there is this concept that it's the promised land, it's the Jews' land, or, I mean, if you're anti-Zionist, then it's everybody's land, or it's some tribe who thinks they're Jewish. It doesn't, that part isn't relevant. What's relevant is that when they came back, the um, the Greeks maintained power over Israel in such a way that when Alexander died and his generals kind of divided up the land, Israel continued to be under the auspices of a colonized or a colonization type of a nation, that being Greece. Now, there's a couple things that are important about that, but the biggest is that at that time there was a rising up of Jews to try to take back their land and sovereignty, and in a way they did, but unfortunately at the consequence of getting into a contractual relationship with Rome. Now, the reason this is important is because when that short period of rising up and taking control of the land occurred, a dynasty of Levitical bloodline had begun to occur. And that Levitical bloodline basically had priests or Levites as kings and or queens. Well, the Pharisaical order basically had come along and said, no, this is supposed to go through the line of Judah. Now, the word Pharisee itself means separatist. And so the separatists of the line of Judah believed that the line of Judah of the house of David was supposed to be the ruling party. Furthermore, they believed that there was a way to prevent Babylonian exile again, and that there was a way to remove occupation. Because we went from Babylonian to Persian to Greek to Roman occupation in Israel. And so it's interesting. And then, of course, it goes Arabic, and then it steps into Christian, and then it steps into the Muslim, and then kind of shifts back and forth for a little bit, and then eventually becomes British Empire. So there was never a time where Israel was unoccupied since Nebuchadnezzar set foot in Jerusalem. Well, Nebuzaradan and his general. Couple things that are very important about that. First is that Torah said that if you would not keep my commandments, that you would lose possession of the land, and they still don't have the land. So here's more proof of Torah still active, still operating as part of the covenant with the sons of Israel. But all of that to say that the Pharisees' intention was to prevent another exile, A, B, to quote unquote, and this is important, create a system by which the piety of the people would cause God to remove the occupiers. Okay? And finally, their third tenet was, so they had the let us make a fence around Torah. In other words, let's make it to where you can't even break Torah. We'll make a list of rules that you follow instead to prevent you from breaking Torah. And we will make disciples, many disciples. In fact, it actually, the word rabbi comes off of the word many, okay? So in that process, then, there is a concept where basically the Pharisees and the Sadducees become the two parties in the Sanhedrin, which is basically the Israeli Senate. Now, a few things that are important about that. Now we understand that the Pharisees were separatists who wanted to restore the throne of David to the house of Israel, and to through the piety of the people, in other words, righteous acts of the people, or the keeping of mitzvot, would cause the occupiers to leave. and finally, of course, to disciple, to make that discipleship. In fact, if you look at the Pharisaical model is actually very similar to other cultures, for example, the Japanese business model, and others, where you make a clonable a clonable salesman, right? So the Pharisees, of course, do go and make these disciples. Well, let's talk a minute about discipleship in the first place. So discipleship in the first place was a concept or an idea that basically you could study under a rabbi. And when you studied under that rabbi, you would travel with him, and he would basically teach you by A, object lessons, B, stories, or what we call Haggadim, right? Agadic teachings. Um, and then of course, so like parables, and then of course, um, through interaction with other rabbis. In fact, to this day, it's actually impossible for a rabbi to go into a public bathroom by himself on the off chance that he might encounter another rabbi and they end up midrashing while they're washing their hands or whatever, and the students miss a lesson. So rabbis often go lock themselves in the family bathroom. So the premise is that basically you start to what? You get in line with your rabbi in such a way that whatever his teachings are, your teachings will be. The reason why stories from the Baal Shem Tov or from Rambam or Rashi have survived is because they were written down, yes, but also because their disciples made sure the stories were accurate. This was a normal, actual occurrence that you could trust. If a person said, in the name of Rabbi Nachman, I say this, then you could trust that that was said in the name of the rabbi because he's the one who taught it to him. Okay? So there's things where there's basically kind of this concept where they followed so closely to their rabbi that they would actually get the dust from the road upon themselves because they were following him. There was a concept that even within the confines of the rabbinical order itself, that rabbis who were teachers of other rabbis were actually able to walk in front of everyone. So there was a concept or a blessing that was said in the land of Galilee, at least, that said, may the dust of your rabbi be upon you, which was a blessing to say, may you learn everything that he has said, and may you become what he is. So Pharisees believed that they needed to put a fence around Torah in order to prevent people from breaking Torah, because then they would guarantee the mitzvot. They would guarantee that the 248 laws that are positive, thou shalt, and the 365 laws that are negatives, thou shalt nots, would be kept because they would never encroach upon that fence. So they designed a system of traditions that would prevent you from ever violating Torah. In fact, they had figured out what would be needed to be done for the Sabbath, what would need to be done for the feast days, what would need to be done for women, what would need to be done for priests, etc., and created traditions that were outside of the Torah so that they never touched the commandments. Because if the people kept Torah or guarded Torah by staying outside that fence, Rome would leave, Greece would leave. Okay? And so why is this so important? Well, there are two reasons. Number one is because Yeshua has said a lot within this verse, right? First of all, who is it? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And what does it say in the NLT? What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees. Who are the scribes? Scribes are the Sopharim, okay? And the Sopharim are basically a very specific group and family of Jews who passed down the very, very important and powerful tradition of writing the Bible. In other words, they would create a copy of the Torah scrolls. Now, before you start to think that there was a breakdown here, you need to understand that the Sopharim were very, very pious and very strict. In fact, most Hebrew letters has about 9 to 20 different strokes within them while you're writing a Torah scroll. If you ever made a mistake, then that scroll would become a practice scroll. If you ever wrote the name of God and then a scroll became a practice scroll, then you were never allowed to destroy it. And so now that scroll becomes the scroll that they bring the children in and they start teaching them the strokes. But when they were done and it was full, then they would roll it up, stick it in a pot, and bury it in the ground. Or they would stick it into a cave, or they would put it into a tomb, like a mausoleum. And so the scribes or the Sopharim, Sopher means to create a scroll. Okay, so the Sopharim is plural. The scribes are the people who write. So, well, how would they for sure know the law? They weren't teachers of the law, but they knew the law to the T because they had to write it. They had memorized every jot and tittle. Consequently, a jot and tittle actually has to do with the crown that's written on the top of the certain letters, which basically spell out an acronym: may Satan's power and his notoriety be erased forever. That's an acronym of letters, and each one of those letters in that acronym get the crown. And in that process, also, there's this concept that the Sopharim have, where they have created large and small letters in the scroll to create certain emphasis. They've done weird things like just thrown a noon upside down in a certain part of the scrolls. All of this is important and relevant. They created a system of making sure that the next generation could reproduce the Bible perfectly. Okay. Why do I say the Bible? Because it was not only the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, but it was the apocryphal writings as well that never made it into the Protestant canon. We could accept that if those apocryphal writings were actually legitimate, they were word for word copies of the original, to the extent where when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we did not only have the Torah, we had this the scroll of Isaiah, and we had the book of Enoch, we had the book of Jubilees, we had the other books that were unrecognizable to people of this modern era, because that was found in like 1948. So the scribes are these people who basically memorize Torah. They know how many letters are in a specific verse. They know how many paragraph counts are in a specific column of Torah. A very, very powerful responsibility. Well, so when he says, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of the religious law, in the NLT, that's kind of inappropriate. But scribes is also not all that appropriate either, because our impression are scribes are these prideful and disrespectful people to Yeshua. Now, I can tell you, if Yeshua is indeed the soul of Torah, as it says, Torah became flesh and dwelt among us, which means whatever Yeshua was before was Torah, then we can assume that what causes a human being to have the breath of life, to exist, is the nefesh, and therefore he is the soul of Torah. Meaning what? He's the most valuable opinion of Torah that could exist. He's going to hold Torah in the highest regard. And what does that mean for the scribes? Well, they're the ones preserving it. So if he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, right? He's actually saying something other than what your actual responsibility is. Scribes were not evil, okay? Pharisees had a very good idea, a very good intention, to the extent that Yeshua says, hey, look, they sit in the seat of Moses, therefore do what they say. Listen to those traditions. And if they don't violate Torah, because in another place he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you have taken the traditions of men and annulled the Torah of God. So we have to make sure that a tradition doesn't annul Torah, for example, the law of Korban. But the premise is that in the meanwhile, we're not going to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so what we really need to do then is understand what he is talking about when he's talking about children of hell. The Pharisees have this complete disconnect from Christianity because of this verse. In fact, the Jews actually have a disconnect from Christianity because of this verse. Should the Pharisees be going around making disciples? Well, not according to this verse. According to this verse, if the Pharisees make a disciple, they make them a child of hell. Well, there's a couple of things that are really important. The first one is, of course, the hypocrite, right? That's one thing that we need to get into. So let's define hypocrisy according to Protestant American Christianity. Hypocrisy is when you don't practice what you preach. But is that actually what a hypocrite was? No, actually, a hypocrite was an actor. An actor. And specifically, the hypocrites were famous actors, like our, Denzel Washingtons and, Kiefer Sutherland's of our time. That's who they were. The hypocrites were entertainers. And these entertainers would basically have an entourage that would go before them and let everybody know that they had arrived in town and to come see the show. Of course. I mean, in salesmanship, right? You act, you make money. That's how it works, right? Then you get to eat. And so the idea was to hype up the people, right? To get them excited about this. And so when he says hypocrites, he's not saying you don't practice what you preach. He's saying you go forward with an entourage, but you're actually entertainers, which is a very, very different kind of description. Where on the one side we have people who basically don't practice what they preach. We call them a hypocrite. What Yeshua was calling a hypocrite was calling entertainers. That they basically have created a show, and that show doesn't have any substance. It's not about whether they don't tithe the right thing or any of those other things. Those are all rabbinical arguments that if you are an American Protestant Christian who only reads the English Bible and has never ever studied the idiomatic extremism of rabbinical midrash, you will never understand what Yeshua was doing when he was engaging these people. When he says, what sorrow awaits, what do we see there? Well, we just see the word hell and we see the word woe, right? Instantaneously. But the biggest fail in Christian translators of this verse, and I want you to remember that Yeshua spoke Hebrew, not Aramaic, not Greek, not any of the other languages that they claim that he spoke. He's speaking in Hebrew here. And so when we do that, we need to honor what's actually being said or what's being spoken. But to really understand this, we really need to grasp the function of the verb, the words that are being used. And what I mean by that is we carry this over to English, we're missing something, okay? Now, I love this simple fact right here. And this special fact is true, and I found it to be important. So let's talk a minute about malevolence. In fact, let's talk about iniquity. So we're going to reverse engineer iniquity. What is iniquity? Iniquity is actually when someone chooses a lifestyle of malevolence. What is malevolence? Malevolence is when you receive in order to receive and you never give. So now you become wealthy, but you do not distribute. You become powerful, but you do not execute justice. Those are malevolencies. So in Hebrew thought, a malevolent person is not a sinner. It's not somebody who violates Torah or who does not protect Torah, who is not a Shomer Torah, but instead is somebody who receives something and does not share. Okay, that's the concept of malevolency. Now, that's different from evil because we know that evil is actually a twisted mind. It's somebody who has wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements, and a lack of imagination who they only use for fear, right? Fear being what? A future event that we imagine and then react to. So a lack of imagination is simply just not using your imagination enough, wanting the answers, etc., etc. So that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about malevolence. Malevolence, what I am talking about is those who actually don't care about Torah, but indulge, and in their indulgence never share. They never give to the poor. They never care for the poor. The Torah commands that there should be no poor among you, which means we have a generalized commandment to elevate every economic status. However, in the next few verses down, it says you will take care of the poor. Meaning what? There will be poor among you, but you need to elevate them. Those two commandments combine to say elevate the poor. Right? So if you are a person of wealth and not one of the poor, then guess what? You are actually experiencing an abundance for the purpose of distribution, but you don't receive that abundance appropriately. You don't think in your mind, I'm receiving this abundance for distribution. The result becomes a malevolency. A person of iniquity chooses to continue in that malevolency regardless of conscience, because remember, Torah is written upon our hearts, and on the day of judgment, Yom Kippur, our conscience accuses or defends us. Now, a part that is very, very important here then to acknowledge is that when we are dealing with this idea of woe, we're not dealing with malevolence. We're saying that what Yeshua is saying here is not woe to you, you're going to hell because you're bad people and you don't believe in me. And not only that, but you keep all these other feasts instead of celebrating my birthday and my resurrection. No, that was Constantine that said that. But what's really important here, and it's absolutely imperative that we get the idea that just because it says hell here, that there is actually something awesome going on, and it's simply this. Your New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and all of the epistles and the book of Revelation are and will always be not Greek. The nuances, the Hebrew idioms versus Greek idioms, etc., 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 are proof that it came from a different translation. Now, what do we have? Copies of copies, right? So we don't even have the original Greek manuscripts. But what were the original Greek manuscripts? They were translations from Aramaic. Why Aramaic? Because after the Hadrian law, it became impossible for Jews to dwell in Jerusalem. And so a lot of them went to Antioch, Babylon, where they spoke Aramaic, right? But so you're going to have Aramaic converts. You're going to have Arameans who are converts into the faith. Well, then obviously you start working with kind of language conversion, right? Well, Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew. And so now we have the Peshitta, right? The Peshitta. And then the Peshitta, which the Aramaic New Testament, is then copied into Greek. I'm about to prove it to you right here. Okay. So the reason I say that it's a good thing is because the word is preserved even into the Greek, just like that word tabernacles is preserved even into the Greek, right? When it says he came and he tabernacled among us, right? And there's a number of other words that are preserved in the Greek. But I will share with you one of the beauties, one of the most wonderful things that I have experienced in my study of the other languages is finding out that Paul, when he addresses the people in the temple, spoke Hebrew to the people. And it says it right there, he spoke Hebrew. In fact, there's a number of places where it says they spoke Hebrew. But then in other places it'll preserve the Aramaic word. Okay? But this is one area where I think it's absolutely imperative that you take notice of something. And here it is. In verse 15, we have the word hell. Now, it is important for you to understand that hell is actually a Norse god, and it could be Hades, could be the label there instead of hell. But I'm going to share something with you. It's neither of those. Watch this. So going into the interlinear and going specifically down to that word hell, it is Gehenna. Okay? Okay? Gehenna. Now, there's a couple of things that are very, very important about this. The first, and this is really, really important, is that it's made up of a Hebrew origin of Hinnom, okay, or lamentation, and from the word valley, okay? Now, let's get back to our text. In the Young's literal translation, we have Gehenna, which is what? Valley of Hinnom. Now, there are so many very, very important things you need to know. One of them, and this is an interesting side fact, Caiaphas' home, now he's not a Pharisee, but Caiaphas' home is actually on the rim of the valley of Gehenna. To the extent that there were times when soot would actually damage the outside of the home. But they know that it was Caiaphas's home. I don't remember how they know that. Anyways, what's important about this, and this is really, really imperative that you get this, it doesn't say hell there. And the word woe is not woe in the Greek, the way that you would think that it is woe, like what we experience. It's actually a transliteration of oi, which was an expression of frustration, right? Used by the Jews. And here is it specifically either spelled this way or spelled this way, but either way, it's oi. And when you go into the Tanakh, or what Christians inappropriately call the Old Testament, oi is an expression of frustration or grief. Oi, right? Now we hear that still to this day in Yiddishkeit, right? The Jews from Europe use oi all the time. Less the Sephardics, less the Mitzrahim, I'm sorry, the Mizrahis, less the Temanite Jews, but the European Jews used oi all the time, okay? Oi was an expression of frustration, or it was an expression of grief, right? Okay, now let me explain to you why that's important. He's going, y'all are driving me crazy, right? That's what he's saying here. He's not saying, whoa, as in you're going to hell and there's going to be fire and brimstone and the days of your life are going to be horrible. You know what? Caiaphas died a rich man. Caiaphas died a rich man. The man, the high priest who convinced the Roman Empire to kill your Messiah died a rich man. So let's get our eyes situated here, okay? Now, I know that you probably think he's in hell, and I get that. But what I want you to first realize is that this particular verse has been painted in such a way that's so inappropriate, and I'm going to prove to you that it's actually a psyop. Now, let me explain a psyop a little bit later on, but for now, just accept that your brain has been tweaked on purpose to do something very specifically. Now, next case and next important piece here is convert. This word convert is so important to this whole entire thing. Okay? So, first of all, it is very important to know that the word lamad, the Hebrew word lamad, which is basically to bring somebody to a greater knowledge, to raise somebody up in knowledge, okay, or to teach, right, is actually connected to the word yaled. So lamad and yaled are actually the same parent root. Now, there's a reason why this is important, but it is simply this element that we need to grasp, and that is that the raising of a child is the same as the raising of a disciple. Okay? So when we talk about this, remember the Pharisees had a salesmanship system where they would create disciples in order to clone their philosophy. Create disciples in order to clone your philosophy, because why? Because we need to get the people to become pious. It was a political move. It was a revolution. And yet we dismiss the Pharisaical order because of this verse right here, that they make children of hell, right? Oh man, you're about to have your head cracked. Okay, here we go. So let's look at this word proselyte really quick, and then we'll come back to the Gehenna, okay? So very specifically, we are looking for this word proselyte, right? A newcomer, okay? And specifically, it is the word proselytos. So here we have an actual word for word transliteration. But what's a proselyte today? Somebody who you've gotten to come to and convert to your religion. Well, I got news for you. The proselytes that they're talking about here have nothing to do with the Gentile inclusion, and I'll explain why. By the time Yeshua gets on the scene, Rabbi Shammai, who's kind of the leader of the Pharisees, has already defeated his opponent through both nefarious and legitimate means. He took over the Sanhedrin with his politics and shut down the followers of Rabbi Hillel. But furthermore, he actually, at one point in time, did some pretty shady stuff where he had some of them murdered because they didn't agree with one of his policies. Policies that had some things to do with the Gentiles, but generally just more of these traditions, right? Let me explain to you something. Rabbi Shammai believed that a Gentile could not be taught Torah and that their hearts and their minds were not able to serve God. He believed they were totally depraved. Oh, we're going to get into that today. But the premise is that Rabbi Hillel believed that all humans could be converted to Judaism, and that that was actually the goal of Torah and the intention of Torah. Now, Rabbi Shammai believed that there was a need to defend Torah from the Gentiles. In fact, his specific part of the Pharisaical order, along with the Sadducees, are the ones who put the soreg in the temple. What's the soreg, you ask? Oh, it's that wall of division, right? That is mentioned in Ephesians that said, if you are a Gentile and cross this line, we are not responsible for your life. In other words, the Jews will kill you if you cross this line. So Gentiles could not enter the temple. And of course, we see that outrage in Acts chapter 21 and 22, where Paul is perceived to be a Greek because of his shaved head. Which means what? Oh, wow. Even to that time period, it was not okay to shave your head. But all of a sudden, there's this concept that you have this Nazirite vow that you take and you shave your head, meaning what? No Jew, unless they were bald, actually shaved their head because of the vow. And so they perceived that he had brought Greeks in because now there was these dudes with these shaved heads, right? Okay, whatever. Either way, what happens, where what ensues is an argument about whether he had brought Gentiles in or not and all the inappropriate things he had done. And of course, he turns around and speaks Hebrew. So when I talk about malevolence, what I mean is that I do not believe that there was an actual choice, a malevolent choice by the translators to actually manipulate the texts. And my proof is in this today. Now, I do believe there's translational bias, as in if you are part of a Calvinist group of people, you're probably going to put the total depravity translation bias into that light. Like you're going to translate the Bible in such a way that it looks like it says this. Now, I know some of that is probably not intentional either, but what I love is what they have preserved. And what they preserved is this word proselytus, right? That's an important word, but also Gehenna and the word Hebrew, right? All these different little hints that this wasn't originally in Greek. But here's something really important. This is not a proper understanding of this word, which means what? It's not what Yeshua said. He did not say proselotos. Okay? He did not say proselotos. He said Talmud. And I'm going to show you, because this says newcomer, right? And it's coming out of pros, which is what? It's a preposition, right? To be nearby or towards, right? And then erkomai, which basically means to enlighten, okay? Or to become light, all right? So, I'm sorry, not erkomai. Erkomai doesn't mean enlightened. Erkomai means to approach or come, so to stand by. And so this was the idea of a newcomer or somebody, and Rabbi Shammai would have never allowed that. He would have never allowed a Pharisee to go to a Gentile and convert them to Judaism and then to a Pharisee. So when Yeshua says you travel the world to make a disciple, it's very important. That was not them trying to convert Gentiles. It was finding Jews who were learned and converting them, the Pharisees, bringing them into their political system, into the revolution against what was formerly the Hasmonean dynasty, to what? Restore the bloodline of David. Is this something Yeshua would have been offended by? No. Why? He's line of David. Here is an Idumean king in power by Rome, right? An Idumean king is part Edomite. That's right. So now we have a Jacob Edomite combo, right? And that's who's in power. And so the Jews are just enraged, right? But the premise is that The Pharisees are trying to restore the bloodline of David. They had come up with a system to detect when the Messiah would be born and how and why and what he would do. Were they mistaken? Well, somewhat, but perhaps not. Had they actually followed him, I believe that there would have been a there would have been an occupation expulsion. They would have left. Okay? But that's another story. But what's important here is for you to know that when Yeshua says you make them more a child of hell than yourselves, what he is actually saying has to do with the word Gehenna. Okay? So now we need to go into this discussion about Gehenna, not hell. I'm going to show you this. I'm going to show you this because you guys need to understand when something is preserved, it's because there was no legitimate translation. Child of hell is not actually what it says in the Greek. And it was important enough to the translators in the NLT environment to make sure they gave a footnote, right? Also in chapter 23, verse 33. But this word Gehenna is not hell. Good old Young's, so reliable to keep words the best he can as they're preserved. So where he could translate, he translated, and where he could not, he did not. And here he could not. Why? Because in the Greek, it is literally written as Gehenna. It was never written as hell, never written as Hades is what actually should be there had it been translated over that way. But this word was preserved from the Hebrew to the Aramaic, to the Greek, to the Latin, to the German, to the English. It survived all of that. And the reason it did, I believe, is because of what hell actually is. Now, a couple of things that are very important here. The first one is that I'm saying that heaven preserved this word, that heaven made sure that this word made it through all the translations and never got put into its specific cultural language context, but maintained its original word. And that word is Gehenna, right? Gehenna. Okay, now what we really need to do is understand what actually was going on in the sentiment of the Pharisees concerning Gehenna and the sentiment of Yeshua as he spoke it. So to really understand that, a couple things that we need to do is we first need to change the way we understand Gehenna, because Gehenna itself was originally called the Valley of Hinnom, is how it's translated in the Hebrew, but I'm about to prove something to you. I'm just going to show you this, okay? All right, so going into Gehenna, we remember that this is the valley of Hinnom, okay? Now, when we look at the Valley of Hinnom, what I want you to see here is that, generally speaking, this is actually how it is written in the Hebrew, okay? So now we're going to use the Blue Letter Bible. We're going to do the same exact thing. We're just going to go Valley of Hinnom. Okay, and then I'm going to have to go get this back to here. Okay, so what's really important here is the what the Valley of Hinnom is. Okay, to understand that, we have to come into 2 Kings chapter 23, and we're looking specifically at verse 10. Then the king defiled the altar of Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom. No one could ever again use it to sacrifice a son or daughter in the fire as an offering to Molech. Okay, now we get into some really interesting theologies. First and foremost, you need to understand the practice of the Gentiles was to worship the God of the land. I will prove it to you. Remember when Israel is exiled out of the land of Israel, they're taken away by the king of Assyria, and he redistributes people who he exiled out of their lands into Israel. All of a sudden, the land turns on them. There's thorns and thistles. There's wild beasts attacking them. There's all this, dry lightning and all these other things that are basically causing them to have great turmoil, enough to basically write the king and say, dude, just so you know, you brought us to a cursed land, right? So then his advisors tell him, go find a priest from the land of Israel who will go to the land of Israel and teach them how to worship the God of that land. In other words, and this is important, the Gentiles at large did not believe in a single creator God, but believed in honoring the gods of the land where they were located. Now, this changes when we start to transition into the Babylonian and Persian Empire. We start to get into a monotheistic creator God. But the thing is that it still has that kind of that pantheon set to it. And what I mean by that is that there's a group of gods. And then when we move into the actual Roman Empire and Greek Empire, they are universal gods, but there's still a pantheon. Okay. My point being is that that ancient peoples during the time of the exile of the Israelites believed in worshiping the God of the land, and that's where this becomes extremely important. You see, Ben Hinnom was son of my sorrow. Ben Hinnom was the name of a valley, and I believe Joshua actually named it. But the God of that land in that specific location was Molech. Okay? Now, Molech is actually a entity whose cultural philosophy contained child sacrifice, and specifically fertility for the sake of sacrifice. So it was interesting how it would work. Is part of worshiping Molech was to get pregnant. Part of worshiping Molech was to get yourself to where you were going to have a baby, but that baby was already designated as going to Molech. Okay? And the way that it worked is it was this huge bronze statue with hands held out like this. And what they would do is they would light a fire inside of the belly of the statue of Molech. And then they would take children and they would lay them on his hands while they were like molten hot from the fire. And that was how they would worship Molech. Well, Josiah comes along, and the first thing he does is he goes and he says, then the king defiled the altar in the valley of Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could ever use it to sacrifice a son or a daughter in the fire as an offering to Molech. He destroyed that thing. Okay. Now, what people don't know is he made it to where they could never, ever, ever again worship Molech. So talk about a king who's eliminating an absolute culture of pantheistic worship. Maybe that's not the right word. Pantheistic. No, that's not the right word. But the idea is he eliminated their ability to worship him. Then what's really interesting is how he did it. He piled dung, right? So all of the poop from Jerusalem went into that valley. And then he piled stones, and then he set it on fire. So you could never get back to the land of Molech again. It was completely uninhabitable, and it was completely, you were unable to. And what was crazy is when he set it on fire, they maintained that fire with the dung from the city. It was the sewer, it was the dump. Okay. Well, as we start to get into the time of Yeshua, they had started to use it to basically dispose of criminals' bodies, specifically if they were going to be burned. Tractate Sanhedrin, I can't remember the number, teaches you about the consequence of burning when you were going to be thrown into that fire or you were going to be put between two hot plates. Point being is after the burning of the person, they were cast into the valley of Hinnom. They were cast into Gehenna. And so the concept was is they didn't receive a proper burial, and Jews and apparently Yeshua believed that your bones were supposed to be preserved. And the reason I say this is because of all the places that the system of things could have occurred, they occurred in Jerusalem, and the belief that if you went into the valley of Hinnom, that your soul could not return to your body in the resurrection, which was a Pharisaical belief. Notice he's not talking to the Sadducees here about Gehenna. It's a Pharisaical belief that if your bones were burned, you would not be able to return to your body. And therefore, Gehenna was a guarantee that your soul could not return in the resurrection. So why is this so important? Well, now we understand that really what he was doing was telling them, I feel sorry for you guys because number one, you travel so far to and actually really it's not that he feels sorry per se, but that he's annoyed by the fact that they travel so far to make a disciple, a Talmud, which I'll explain in a minute, and yet they actually are going to become more of a criminal who needs to be thrown into the fire because of their violations of Torah than you are. Now, there's a couple things that are really important. Number one, you need to remember that even John, in writing this letter of John in 1 John chapter 5, verses 15 and 16 says, there are sins unto death and sins not unto death. And in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, it says that sin is a violation of Torah. Okay? Hamartia is a transgression or a falling away from Torah, nomos. Okay? And so the reason why that is so important is because when you look into that verse in the Greek, hamartia means to be separated from the inheritance. So a separation from inheritance is a falling off or a falling away from the prescribed path. That's actually what it says in the Greek. And so what was he saying here? What was John saying here? Well, first of all, it wasn't written in Greek, but it was translated that way. So idiomatically, it probably said something along the lines of that a being outside the camp or outside of your people is actually the result of a falling, nephalim, a falling away of Torah, right? So that sin or the separation is actually a falling away from Torah. And that's probably how it was written. Now, there's reasons why this is important. The first reason is because when we get into the concept of Gehenna, we realize that this is a actual temporal system in the understanding of philosophy of the Pharisees, and Yeshua is speaking their language so that they can understand what they're doing, right? You guys are so annoying. Now, remember, this is Yeshua using rabbinical midrashic arguments to explain his position. Do you know how many times rabbis have sat down at a table, begun to discuss Torah, took a position, the other one took a different position, and the other one called them a child of hell? Called them a child of Gehenna? Yeshua's like, you guys are driving me crazy. You sit here and do all this work to try to make a proselyte, and you're making him more of a criminal than yourselves, right? Because what one generation allows in moderation, the next will carry to the extreme. That's just true. Children become zealous for their parents' philosophies. And truth be told, is same is true for a disciple. Because why? A disciple is actually a son in the sense of learning of a rabbi. And so in context, then, what we have is we have this idea that this concept of proselytizing people, of Jews proselytizing people, is actually causing them to become children of hell. How anti-Semitic, how translationally biased can you get with your psychological operation, your psyop? Okay, so now there's a couple things that we need to get into here. The first, and this is important, is that Josiah makes the valley of Hinnom, the valley of the son of Hinnom, or Ge ben Hinnom, a trash heap, a sewer, the dump. All your trash, all your poop, and all your bad people get put in this pile that burns and does not cease. How do we know that? Because it kept smoldering during the exile. That's right. It stayed smoldering even while they were in Babylon for 70 years. And so now you could see where the worm does not cease and the fire is not quenched. You see, this is the mistake that Christians make, is they sit on Sunday morning in a pew and listen to hogwash that's propagated by a psyop that was created years ago to make you be a certain way, to tweak your brain so that you would not step into the liberties, the power, the authority, and the corporate collective consciousness that is the true religion of Yeshua HaMashiach, the true religion of Jesus Christ. Now, where do we start to get into the focus of evangelism in this? Because they are traveling to make disciples. We need to understand what a disciple is for a Pharisee, because that's exactly what Yeshua tells them to go do. In fact, and let's go take a look at that. That's an important statement that I just made, sufficient enough that we probably need to go and look a little bit deeper. So let's go into Matthew chapter 28, okay? Going down to verse 20. And actually, let's go into verse 19. Having gone then, this is Young's literal, having gone then, disciple all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all whatever I command you, right? Okay, so and I know I skipped part of that there, but I'm going to jump over into 19, and specifically we're going to go down to the word disciple. Do you see it anywhere? What does it say? It says, go ye therefore and teach all nations. Okay? So I want you to understand that this word, disciple, is actually not there. The word that's being translated as disciple, right, is that word teach, which is what? Uh-oh, look at that. It is actually this Greek word, mathe to, I'm sorry, matheio, UUO. Okay. Coming from what? A mathetes or a mathaneo, right? A learner or pupil. So where is this important? Why is this important? Because when we're looking at the Greek, we need to understand what their understanding of a disciple is in the Greek language versus what a Hebrew understanding of a disciple is in the Hebrew language, okay? And notice that it is the Hebrew word lamad. And all I did there was go into the roots, further and further into the roots. But it's that word lamad, where we get the Hebrew word talmid. What is a talmid? A student. Okay? Now, getting back to our word that's actually there, we see that it is to be a disciple of one. And so who translated this better? Did 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 the Young's Literal or did the NLT? Therefore go and make disciples. No, what does it say? Go and disciple these people. Go use the technique of discipling. Where did Yeshua get that idea? Clone the philosophy. Take the philosophy, clone it, and give it to another and have them clone it. Man, this is multi-level marketing at its finest, right? The premise is you go and you hit the group with the philosophy. You clone it exactly, just like in the name of Rabbi Yosef, I say, why? Because he taught me this philosophy, and I say this is the proper interpretation. That's what the Gemara is. Gemara is, Talmud is the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnaic statements of the rabbis. What's the Mishnah? The Mishnah is a written down compendium of the oral traditions that were argued in the Sanhedrin or in the Pharisaical circles and was then later decided to become law. Right? Okay. So why is this so important? Well, when we get into the concept of Talmud, now we have a very important thing we need to ask. Was the philosophy of our Rabbi Yeshua HaMashiach, was it cloned? Was it preserved the way the rabbinical has been preserved? Couple things. Anthropology and archaeology has significantly found, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Anthropology and archaeology have found significant proof of a belief in the afterlife that always contained two things: a place where you were not yet in the afterlife, like a waiting place, and a place that was good enough to give possessions for the next transition. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we talk about hell, it does not have merit within the anthropological and archaeological historical evidence of mankind. Hell is a creation. And in order to really understand how hell functions as a creation, it is important that we start to look into words that are translated as the word hell into the English and what they meant in the Hebrew or the Greek. Notice here, Gehenna is a reference to the fire pit where the trash, the poop, and the bad people go. Okay? Never was it anything more than that. It was never a philosophy about the afterlife. In fact, Yeshua on a few occasions mentions a world to come. That world to come is the Jewish philosophy of the next life, or the life after this life, after you go to a place of waiting. Okay? So it's interesting because what we really find is we find a temporal type of non-heaven philosophy in all the ancient peoples, all the philosophies of the world that predate Yeshua. And then we find Yeshua mentioning some form of there being a place that you go that is something you get to participate in a good way, right? But never is there a mention of an eternal conscious suffering in any of Scripture, okay? Any of the Bible. Now, that is important because then when we do things like, for example, when David says, if I make my place or I make my bed in hell, you are there. What was David talking about? Well, the concept was that the prostitution section of the city was known as Sheol, the place of the dead. Okay? And so if I make my bed in prostitution, you're there. I can't get away from you. Oh, who brought that up? Paul, when he says you're a temple of the Holy Spirit, you have Christ within you, so why would you go into a prostitute? Repeating David, right? But we go and say, oh, that's proof that God is present in hell, that people are aware that they chose not to have God. Oh man, if you knew what's actually happening here. Okay, so Sheol comes from the Hebrew root Sha'al. Sha'al means to ask a question, and very specifically to ask an authority, as in requesting teaching. Oh, and this is very powerful because it says, She'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That's right. Sha'al means to pray, to request from an authority. And so Sheol is a question. In fact, it's actually, here's the crazy part about it, it's the infinitive of Sheol. So really, it's saying when you die, we don't know what happens. And that was the philosophy. And the philosophy said that if that's true, we don't really know what happens after you die, we're not going to ask. Why? Because we're supposed to live this life now. We're supposed to give Torah to the nations now. We're supposed to change the attitude of the people now so that the next generation is better than the last instead of worse than the last. And of course, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, so we've continued to perpetuate the problem. But we're perpetuating it because of a very specific thing, and this is what you need to know. You need to know that the corporations of the world need you to be in a certain state, and I'm going to explain that state here in a minute. Now, in that process, there's two very important things you also need to know. It is not truth. It is not a cloning of Yeshua. I will prove it to you. So John, the disciple of Yeshua, possibly the disciple whom Yeshua loved. In other words, they were close. It is there's a very, very good chance that he was obedient to Yeshua's command to go make a talmid, make a disciple, and then baptize him. Now, here's the crazy part about it. Yeshua repeats the process that the rabbis practice even to this day. He says, you go teach them first, then baptize them, right? But it's actually not what you think when it comes to baptism, because that's another problem that we have, and that is membership. But we'll get into that. Okay, so now here's the next piece, and this is an important one. Now what we have is this idea that you are supposed to make a disciple, which is what? Clone the philosophy. What philosophy? The philosophy that Yeshua taught in his agadic language, his midrashic arguments with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and his lifestyle choices, which was what? Torah, and one of humility, and one of gentleness and mercy. Okay, those are all pieces of the puzzle. But point being is, John had to make all of those true, and then had to do exactly what the Pharisees did. I'm going to explain to you why. If John did not use the Pharisaical philosophy of discipleship, the next generation would break down, which means what? When a rabbi is made a rabbi by a rabbi, he is to clone the philosophy of his rabbi. Okay? However, in that process, he is allowed to bring his own wisdom into his teachings. Okay? But we're going to clone that original. We're going to preserve that original philosophy down through. So next, here comes Polycarp. Okay, now there's a lot of things that people say about Polycarp. They say that he has some very inappropriate teachings, blah, 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 blah. In fact, a lot of people say, oh, you don't read all the things about Polycarp. Well, I'm not entirely convinced that all of them are true either. Why not write some disinformation about Polycarp because of his choice? What was his choice? Well, there were two. Number one is he refused, absolutely refused, to change the date of the Passover to the Easter holiday. And he furthermore believed that it was to be kept on the quaternarian, on the 14th of Nisan. In fact, he was called, or I'm sorry, not quaternarian, on the quarter, or on the 14th of Nisan, not quarter. So the principle is that a quaternarian was somebody who believed that the Passover was to be preserved. Well, this other bishop, so remember, Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna. Remember Smyrna from Revelation? Bishop of Smyrna. So a very good leader in charge of Smyrna to be receiving a letter from John. Oh, that's interesting. And so in its process, we know that John would have taught Polycarp to preserve the philosophy, to clone the philosophy of the rabbi. Who was the rabbi? John was rabbi, right? And so now Polycarp brings this argument to, gosh, I can't remember his name right now. I think it's Aeneas or Annas. Anyways, he is the bishop of, I can't remember who he was the bishop of. But anyways, he says that Peter and Paul went to Rome and taught them that they should keep Easter. So here's Polycarp. He's like, yeah, okay, you're out of your mind. John taught me this. And I know that Peter and Paul were in agreement with John. So let's stop the dumb stuff here. Well, then all of a sudden out in the middle of nowhere, a law comes into place that says that you have to acknowledge Caesar as deity, as God. And Polycarp perceives from his teachings of John that that would be considered idolatry. And so Polycarp actually refuses and is eventually burned at the stake. So he goes to his death cloning the philosophy of his rabbi, who was who? John, who cloned the philosophy of his rabbi, who was who? Yeshua, which means up until Polycarp, we have a preservation of philosophies. We have a preservation of the original sect that was started by Yeshua as a sect of the Pharisees. Now, it is important in all of this process. Why do I say that? Because Yeshua was called rabbi. We don't call people rabbi unless we're of the Pharisaical order. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that part. Okay, so now the premise is what we got now is this idea that this other group says, oh, we got to change it to Easter. Fast forward to 325 AD. What do we have? We have a non-cloned philosophy. The letter of Constantine, which you can find in the writings of Eusebius, I believe. I think it might be like chapter 4, but I'm not for sure on that. Basically says that the Jews are a problem and being like them is a problem and acting like them and thinking like them and talking like them is aligning with them, and they killed the Christ. They're patronides. It was called, or patricides. Patricides. They killed the Father, right? Constantine writes that to who? The Council of Nicaea, who just so happens to have sitting on their panel the guy who disagreed with Polycarp. Wonder how he survived that whole telling Caesar that he's God thing. Anyway, so let's continue into the Council of Nicaea. Now makes these decisions to what? To cut Passover completely off. Is that preserving the soul of Torah's philosophy on Torah? Absolutely not. Oh, but it gets better. Because now what do we have? We have all citizens, Treaty of Milan, all citizens, or Edict of Milan, sorry, all citizens of the Roman Empire. You are to be idle on the venerated day of the sun, except farmers who we still need to do agriculture, but they can have a day of rest too, just not Sunday. Not quite sure how that works, but okay. Oh, and by the way, these people who we call Christians, which is a derogatory term, who are actually the sect of the Jewish Pharisaical order of the way, will now have rights. And not only are we going to give them rights, but we're going to let them worship on that day. In fact, everybody is to worship their God on the venerated day of the sun, thus uniting his empire. Well, eventually, I'm going to say it was getting somewhere into the 400s, or maybe it was the 300s. They eventually decided that unless you were actually Christian, which was basically where the influence of these slaves had eventually become into regular citizenship, and they were allowed to serve in the military, to being in the Senate and having power, to moving all the way into the realm of leadership of the Roman Empire. They declare somewhere in 300 that Rome's official religion was Christianity, and anyone who practiced any other faith or any other philosophy or any other thing was a heretic, a sinner, and they were condemned, or they did not have absolution. They did not have deliverance from their sins. That's when the term Catholic Church became the actual term to describe the empire. At around 600-ish, a philosophy began to be propagated throughout the empire. And that philosophy was that if you did not stay in the religion of the empire, you were going to go to a bad place. Now, what you need to understand is what the underworld was for the Romans. And then you need to understand what it was for the Greeks. And what you need to understand is that what we call it today is actually Norse. It's Scandinavian pagan lore, right? Thor, Odin, all that stuff. And look, we've got Thursday, Wednesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I mean, it's all in our culture. So the word hell actually definitely has something to do with suffering. Well, yes, it was the God of suffering. So what's it doing in the supposedly cloned philosophy of Yeshua HaMashiach? Well, it's accompanied by a belief that is propagated by a number of writers that basically claim that all humanity, now this all of a sudden happens, this doesn't gradually present. This all of a sudden happens out of the middle of nowhere. They start propagating this belief that Shammai propagated, that Gentiles or people outside of the religion are actually totally depraved. Now, I want you to watch how this works. You are now going to have this philosophy that unless you're part of and obedient to an empire, you are actually evil. In fact, you were born evil and you need the empire to save you. Do you see this? And so eventually this starts to work its way into Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost and a number of other things. And by the time of the Spanish Inquisition, hell is so terrifying, people are paying money to be delivered from hell. In fact, so much so that they actually have decided to start creating converts by force, burning a Jew with brands and torturing his family in front of him until he confesses the confession of Christ. And then while he has surrendered to that, he is then he prepares to be baptized, and they hold a cross on his head and hold him underwater until he drowns so that he cannot recant. Saved. The outrage of the reality that this is a psychological operation, that this was designed to cause your mind to be obedient to the empire, carries forward into the Anglican Church when the Protestants separate from the Catholics and the king becomes the Pope of the religion of England. So the Anglican Church has the king as the Pope, as the vicar of Christ. Right? Now, they didn't call it the Vicar of Christ because that was one of Luther's outrages. And the aggravating part of this is that Luther was an Augustinian monk. Augustine was the one who solidified total depravity. Calvin was a disciple of the man who studied under Augustine personally. So Calvin, in his total depravity, right, which is the number one on Tulip, right, of the 5 points of Calvinism, he is propagating, he's cloning the philosophy of his rabbi, who did not clone the philosophy of their rabbi. And now you understand that hell is just a mechanism of that psyop to get you to be obedient to the empire. Continued to be propagated by Calvin, by Luther. Hell is a product of a psychological operation to manipulate your mind to believe that you need to do two things. Number one, you need to be saved by the empire. And number two, you need to make disciples. Because we have to save the world from hell. We have to deliver them from their philosophies that make them believe that they don't have to be obedient to the empire. And now we have what? A Protestant Christian nation. A Lutheran Calvin hybrid. And people are passing out tracts. They're going and standing in front of a bar and saying, repent. You need to repent from your behaviors. They don't even know why a person was in a bar, and they're handing them a tract, thinking they're not saved. I had a friend who would do those things, and women or men would come out of the bar and say, I'm a Christian. What are you doing? And he said, well, what are you doing in there? Right? Because supposedly he had identified that Yeshua didn't consume alcohol, which is absolutely asinine as well. But the premise, and this is an important one, is the empire saves you. So now we believe that if we go to church on Christmas and Easter, we're okay. We're a good Christian American because we go and sit in church on Sunday. I go to church. Right? And then we have the charismatics saying, oh, yeah, you need to do more than go to church. You also have to speak in tongues, and that's proof that you have the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit seals your salvation. So the proof that you're saved is that you're this. And it's all actually a psyop. By what? The oldest corporation in the world. The Catholic Church is the oldest corporation in the world. In fact, if you watch not a demographic, an anthropologic system of civilizations, you will find that there is this huge strip of money in the world going to the Catholic Church, that it's not until the 1900s that we actually start having millionaires come along and make more money than the Catholic Church. In fact, interestingly enough, the Catholic Church itself is grossing around $4 to $6 billion a year. And in that sense, and this is important, they could buy Pfizer, who has what? Created an empire that made you dependent on their medications, made you dependent on their foods, made you dependent on their stuff, so that they're always the one in control. Again, a psyop. Your medical system is a psyop. Your healthcare system is a psyop. But the biggest and worst of them all is when they taught you that you were born evil. And they taught you that you have grown up in a state of destined for hell. And only those who accept Christ are those who would actually be delivered from hell. It's all a lie. And it is such a horrible lie that it has actually caused people to commit suicide. It's caused people to believe they'll never succeed. Why? Because they were born evil. It's too much of a struggle to be good. Associating the wrong thing with the wrong thing consistently causes something to become associated with that thing. So now you don't believe that you're good. You don't believe that you have the potential to change this world, that you have the potential to bring people out of these wounds and these limiting beliefs. You just behave yourself, sit in the pew, and obey the empire. And you think for a second that the church isn't the empire. You got another thing coming, because all of the colleges clone their rabbi, the Augustinian monk, the disciple of the disciple of Augustine. It's all there. Follow the money trail, follow the philosophy trail. It's all there. You Protestant American Christians have been duped, manipulated, tricked. And what you're doing is you're going out and making another disciple. You're making another person become obedient to the empire, to be a docile people who swear poverty into their lives, who swear obedience to the state without any challenge to the system. You funny people who say, oh, those sheeple over there on this side, they are so manipulated by all these things, and we are awake, even though we don't call ourselves woke. We're more awake than they are. No, you're not. You're just as stupid. You're just as manipulated. And when I say stupid, it's very important for you to understand. I'm not talking about your intellect. I'm talking about the fact that you don't think enough for yourself to check and find out what I'm saying is true. You would rather think that I'm a heretic and that I'm challenging the very doctrines of the Nicene Creed. You're darn right I am. Right? Because why? Because uh in the Nicene Creed, I can't remember where, and quite frankly, I'm glad I can't remember it. I should probably for the sake of these videos, though. It says something about hell. It flat out has hell in the creed. And if you don't say the creed, you're not saved. If you don't fit if you don't fit the essentials, they're called the essentials. When I first started studying theology, it's probably maybe second year, and it's not soteriology, which would be the study of salvation. Um, it's the study of what's required, and I can't remember the name of it right now. Well, the Greek name of it, but I can tell you that it's about, and this is important, it is about what's required for somebody to believe that you're a part of the empire. So it is very important for you to understand that this whole thing has been a trick, a manipulation by Satan? No, by human beings in power. Satan had nothing to do with this. Some philosophy of total depravity who was formed by Rabbi Shammai, who had a chip on his shoulder about the Roman occupiers. That's why he believed that Gentiles couldn't be saved, is because they were horrible to the people of Judah. They were horrible. But the whole thing, that was a psyop too. That was an attempt to make sure that they were never, ever not miserable, so that they would consider just relinquishing their power and letting Rome rule Israel. Because Rome couldn't rule Israel. They knew that the Jews would step up. So were you born evil? It's not what my Bible says. And if we accept that the word evil is the twisted mind, when it says every imagination of their heart is evil and violence continually from childhood, and we've already discovered that's actually teenage years. Oh man, if we get into that, come on, guys. Which one of you was not an absolute moron while you were a teenager? Right? It makes sense. That's when those imprintings are occurring. That's when our parents' wounds actually begin to activate as roles and as identities in us as we start to become adults. Especially if you look at the idea that a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah means it's a man and a woman and not a child anymore. That's a different culture, though, and it's a different understanding of what we have in America, where the moment you turn 18, all of a sudden you have all these things that you didn't have before, that you're allowed to do and have, which have nothing to do with your spiritual maturity, nor your psychological maturity for that fact. If you study the subject of human development in psychology, which consequently, just so you know, psychology was a theology at one point in time. Psychology was one of the psycheology is the study of the soul. So now psychology has kind of broken itself away from religion, but the truth be told is it's a religion in and of itself. But if you study cradle to the grave, if you study human development, psychology 105, I believe it is, maybe in college or whatever, you will see that a person's maturity is not based upon their age, but instead about their nature versus nurture, their original temperament versus their environment influencing them. But the premise is that within all of that now we understand that we're not totally depraved. Then what disciples are we supposed to be making, and what are we supposed to be showing? Well, I can tell you, if we look at the model of Yeshua, if we look at all of his agodic stories, right? His allegorical parables, and we look at his midrashic arguments to the other Pharisees, right? And we look at the fact that he was stumping people when he was 12 years old, and we look at the fact that he kept all of the commandments perfectly. He was always tempted but did not sin. And we look at the fact that he did all these things. Our rabbi gives us a demonstration of what we are supposed to do all the way to the cross. He says, if you don't take up your cross and follow me, you have no part of me. You can't be my disciple. And if you can't be my disciple, don't be going trying to clone something. If we make the mistake, if we go, as we say, okay, here's a track. Up, say the sinner's prayer. Up, yep, dunk them in the water. Up, yep, they're fine. Okay, I can mark that one off my list. And what you actually doing is creating a follower of the empire. You want to talk about a matrix. You want to talk about a system that you feed. It's your evangelism. And I can tell you right now, that's terrifying to a Christian to hear that. It's terrifying to hear that hell actually doesn't exist and that it is a system to manipulate you to create more people to be obedient to the system. Because it's easier to govern a people through fear than through reward. That's a psychological truth, that it is easier to inoculate disobedience through fear than through reward. But it is not the philosophy of Torah. It is not taught that way. It is taught that obedience brings blessing. Faith brings the birthright. Obedience brings the blessing. You want to be adopted into the house of God? You want to become an Israelite? Then guess what? All you got to do is believe you are. But here's the crazy part about it. If you do, you need to start acting like one. You need to start acting like a son of Israel. How many times did Moses say, or did Yahweh say to Moses, speak to the sons of Israel? Listen, don't go reading the Old Testament in any shape or form in one of your yearly Bible readings or in some other thing like that, and think for a second that when it says speak to the sons of Israel, that it applies to you unless you are Israel. To Israel belongs the adoption. Romans chapter 9, verse 6, I believe. So why is this so important? Because the reality is that you've been lying to yourself. Torah is written on your heart. If a Gentile, though not having the law, does the things of the law, Paul, right, speaking in Romans chapter 2, verse 14, does the things of the law, then they show themselves to be a law unto themselves. What does that mean? That means that they're actually making their own rules about that walk, and that the law has been written on their heart. In another place, it says that the circumcised show themselves as uncircumcised when they sin, and that the uncircumcised show themselves as circumcised when they do the things that are written upon their heart. The Torah has been written on your heart, so you are lying to yourself. If you believe in hell, you are lying to yourself. And if you believe that you need to save somebody from hell, you are lying to yourself. Because the Torah is not telling you that. Remember my thing last week where I said, look, who told Eve not to touch the tree? Did Yahweh? No. If Adam had cloned the philosophy, if Adam had done what his rabbi had said and repeated to his Talmud the Torah correctly, then there would be no incongruity. There's an incongruity within you, and it's been bothering you for a while. And truth be told is, since it's been bothering you for a while, you're kind of in a state of aggravation with God. You don't understand why every time you turn around, something is not going the way that the pulpit is teaching you. Oh, but then they did something worse. They've got everybody in a rapture-induced stupor. Here comes the Calvinist who's a 5-point Calvinist, John Nelson Darby, a Bible translator, like a lot of his translation actually, and says, oh, here's what happened. God just changed his mind according to how people responded to his covenants. And so we have the dispensation of the law, dispensation of this, dispensation of grace. And we're in the dispensation of grace now. And so you don't really have to keep the law. But oh, by the way, here's the cool thing about it. When things start getting kind of rough, he's going to come along, he's going to take you away. And here's the proof right here, this word harparzio, right? And they're going to whisk you away and remove you from the earth. And then the judgment's going to come because we've been preserved from the wrath to come. And here it is in Thessalonians and Romans and Corinthians, the twinkling of an eye at the last trump. You don't even know what the last trump is, but at the last trump, right? And so then now, not only are you obedient to the empire, never challenging it, right? But here's the worst part. You believe that it's going to be better when you're dead, and all you're doing is longing for the day when Christ comes and whisks you away or you die. Boy, you're an effective human being. No wonder we're dependent on poisons for our medication, because the people who should be rising up and demanding a reform of some sort are just going with the flow. And they think they're better than this group because this group over here has gone completely crazy. Or they think they're better than this group over here because this group has gone completely crazy. You don't realize that whole thing's a psyop too, to get you to behave in the empire. By telling you that you can't do it yourself, by telling you that you yourself are evil from birth. American Protestant Christianity has this nation believing that we are evil from birth. And whenever somebody wakes up and realizes that's not true, they're a heretic, they're woke, or they are some other thing, and therefore they are what? They're crazy. Oh, the sickness that we're dealing with here in the oldest corporation in the world. Now, let's take it a step further. Not only are we working with the idea of total depravity, and we're working with the idea of an ineffective human, we're working with the idea of that okay, so let's get this straight. I'm evil. I can't actually do any good, right? That's number one. Number two, I can't choose Christ, right? That's kind of the propagation of American Christianity. You can't choose Christ. You have to be drawn by the Holy Spirit. And since you can't choose Christ, that means that only certain people actually can choose Christ. And those are the chosen, right? Because many are called, but few are chosen. That's an inappropriate translation of that scripture. And then we'll take it a step further and say only those are the ones who are going to go in the rapture. Because if you're sinning while the rapture occurs, you're not going. Okay, let me just get this straight. Woo, 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 woo. Let's hit this one. Ready? If you are violating Torah when the rapture occurs, you're not going. Because sin is a violation of Torah. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Boy, cracked that egg, didn't I? Okay, so now when we're talking about a psyop, there's a couple things you need to know. And that is that your brain, when things are repeated, disconnects from any logic and just lets that repetition become truth. Your brain will connect things together, especially when they are repeated consistently. Where? In your pew, baby. Do you hear me? Your pulpit is parroting what its schools taught, what the philosophy that has been taught, which was ran by the empire that told you to be obedient to the empire in the first place, told you that you cannot survive without the empire. Oh man, does that sound crazy like the manual for communism on how to take over a nation, right? But then we get into we get into all kinds of philosophies and concepts here where what we're working with is groupthink. You're now telling a person that they are going to suffer for eternity unless they're obedient to the empire. You're a good Christian. Now, having said that, Do I believe that your heart is malevolent in that behavior? No, you are manipulated. You are being manipulated. And that manipulation is actually causing something really bad, a perpetuation of power. Now, do I say rise up and let's break down the empire? No. You know what? I can tell you right now, if we did that, we would totally break. Okay? But what you need to do is realize that that's what's going on. So when you make a disciple, and this is absolutely important, when you make a disciple, you run them through a 1-year Torah cycle. You say, where is that? Oh, I'll show you. Acts chapter 15, verse 21. After they determined that people do not need to be circumcised to inherit the covenant of Israel, but instead need to be circumcised to inherit the covenant of Abraham. In other words, you want to be a part of the land and the promise, you need to be circumcised. You want to be a part of the covenant of God and be the house of Israel and have all the blessings and all the whatevers of Israel? Just believe. Just accept it, right? And they say, but we do definitely want them to restrain themselves from eating blood. Well, that would be important, right? We want to restrain them from being cruel to animals. We want to restrain them from approving of cruelty to animals. We want to restrain them from sexual immorality, defined by what? Sexual morality of the Gentiles? Come on, people. What was James' philosophy on sexual immorality? Leviticus 18, Leviticus 22, incest, force, right? Deviance from natural order processes. So in that process, then what we do is we get into this idea that oh, that's all we have to do. I'm a Gentile, that's all I have to do. But then it says in verse 21, for, what does that mean? That means because of that fact, Moses is preached in the synagogues every Sabbath since ancient times being Ezra's time. Why is that important? Because then you will hear Torah. Where were they going to congregate? In the synagogues until the 19th prayer, right? The 19th prayer that kicked the Gentiles out of the synagogues of the Amidah, of the Shemona Esrei, where you are standing and davening and saying your prayers. Now you have to curse yourself, and so they stop going to the synagogues. Another contrivance of Shammai. And consequently, and this is important, a imagination of a pope after he had become king of the empire religion in 300. And what's really important is in that time period, now all of a sudden there needs to be a way to convince the people that they need the religion, that they need the empire, that the empire's good. I don't need to show you what the empire did, but I can tell you what they did the worst was to the Jews and the Muslims. Now, it is important in this process that you understand that there is a concept or a philosophy here that needs to be unlearned. If I tell you, you were born good, your mind is not going to believe me. Do you know why? Because I am not consistently associating that truth over time with you. I'm telling you one time, you were born good. You were not born evil. You are not destined for hell. You're not going to hell. That's not why we make disciples. We make disciples to clone the philosophy. The philosophy of whom? The soul of Torah. The soul of Torah made a philosophy. His disciple cloned it. His disciple cloned it. His disciple was killed for it. We haven't even scratched the surface of cloning. We haven't scratched the surface of discipling truth. You are supposed to take your rabbi's philosophies, his lifestyle, his choices, and clone them and become it. And then your students, you are supposed to be teaching the same thing to, along with your life experiences and wisdom. You know how many times the Baal Shem Tov, his disciple comes to him and says, can you help me understand divine intervention? So he takes his disciple out, well, he takes all of his disciples out into the field and eventually into the forest. They're walking. Storm clouds start to come in. Pretty soon it starts to rain. And at the same time, leaves are falling. All of a sudden, Baal Shem Tov stops. Okay. Now, this is kind of where he definitely was a mystic, right? He stops. He says, pick up that leaf. The man picks up the leaf, and underneath is a little creature. He said, not one leaf falls to the ground without it being a divine intervention, because that little creature was shielded from the rain by the leaf. That's how a rabbi teaches. That's how truth is propagated. Why is that? Because it's agadic. It's story. What do? We say, oh, what's your testimony? When did you become a Christian? What are we doing? We're asking, trying to make sure that that's not somebody we need to check off our list to make sure that they are obedient to the empire, right? Because we're brainwashed. And so we look and we say, oh, yeah, tell me your testimony. And then we judge it. Does that meet the essentials of salvation? When did Christ become Lord of your life? Right? And then we decide, right? We judge and decide whether or not they need to be saved, right? By the empire. Okay, so the concept is that you tell your story, because association with something consistently, pairing two things together consistently, creates a memory within the subconscious. And so I could tell you, you're good. You won't believe me because you've been told forever. It's embedded in your DNA that you are evil. It's embedded in your DNA that you are totally depraved. It's embedded in your DNA as an American Christian Protestant. I know some of you are watching from around the world, but an American Christian Protestant is absolutely repeating what's been epigenetically written upon their DNA. Because why? Because their ancestors were manipulated and brainwashed and told it, and so they believed it and lived it. So now we have this conviction to help somebody not have to go to hell. Oh my gosh, there's so many Christians I've talked to whose loved ones have died and they're not sure that they've gone to hell or not. And I'm just like, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, right? Because, and I can tell you, one of the things that is absolutely true is it will affect your business. It will affect your performance as a parent. It will affect your performance as a spouse. You are not evil. Are you wounded? Do you have entitlements? Do you have limiting beliefs? Yep, let's fix that. Schedule an appointment or whatever, and let's get that straight. But here is the part that's really important. In all of this, you need to take a stand and begin to learn the ancient language. You know, your founder, Luther, let me tell you something. He says, if you want to become a teacher of the Word of God, you are a fool in your philosophies and your understandings unless you learn the ancient languages. Which means you take some of that hard-earned money and you go and you get on and you get basics of biblical Hebrew or basics of biblical Greek, right? And start learning. Because one of the things that's going to shock your brain is when the pulpit repeats something that's not there. Like, thus he made all foods clean. A footnote in a translation transcript, not the verse itself. And I can tell you, then they've got all these people say, oh, yes, I understand textual criticism. And I can tell you after all this time, I've concluded that, that. And oh, by the way, I've studied the Hebrew and all the anthropology and the archaeology, and I'm absolutely convinced that Yahweh had a wife named Ashtoreth, right? And all the Bible was written by about 5 different people who believe different philosophies about God. Okay, I'm just going to put this out here. It's written on your heart. Torah is written upon your heart. How do I know that? Yeshua stands up on the last at the Last Supper, right? He stands up. The last time he's ever going to eat with his disciples, says, I want you to take this glass of wine and I want you to drink it. And as often as you do it, which is what at Passover, as often as you do it, I want you to do it in remembrance of me. I want you to remember me during the Passover. Why? Because I am the soul of Torah, and I want you to remember Torah at Passover. I want you to remember he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. I want you to remember that you're the righteousness of God when you drink that cup. But he says, this is the new covenant sealed in my blood. Jeremiah 31, chapter 31, verses 31 through 34 says, behold, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This is the covenant I'll make with Israel. I will write my Torah upon their hearts. Are you part of the new covenant or are you not? What are you doing drinking that cup? If you're not part of the new covenant, it says Torah is written on your hearts. Torah has been written on your hearts. Paul believed it about the Gentiles. Torah had been written upon their hearts. And that Yom Kippur actually convicted them. Yom Kippur, their conscience would excuse them or defend them. The people in America don't even know what Yom Kippur is. They know it's a Jewish holiday and then somewhere in September, October, that's about it. Most Jews only know it because that's the only time they go. Just like a Christmas and Easter Christian, they only go on Yom Kippur and make Sadaqah. Every synagogue gets in the black. That's their Black Friday. Jewish Black Friday is Yom Kippur. Because Jews go and they pay some money, say that's their righteousness and that's their repentance or whatever, and then boom, that's done. Now they don't have to worry about synagogue again until next year. So don't think just because I say that Luther was anti-Semitic, or I say that Nicaea was anti-Semitic, or I say that the translation of this verse in Matthew is anti-Semitic, you need to understand something. I say the same thing about the Jews. These anti-missionary rabbis trying to prove that Yeshua didn't exist, trying to prove that he was, what was the latest one I heard where he was a child of a false marriage and therefore was never allowed to enter the temple. Therefore, he couldn't have entered the temple when he was 12 years old, and therefore he couldn't have argued with the rabbis. Stop. What is going on here? I'm going to tell you. It's all the same thing. You are to be obedient to the empire, and you need to go make disciples so that they will be obedient to the empire too. And over time, we can just influence the entire population to behave. But at what cost? Are we talking about Constitution here? I think we're talking about something higher, aren't we? We're talking about where we are preserving the soul of Torah. We're talking about where we are not cloning. We're talking about where we are going along and we're just coming up with our own philosophy and then going along and assigning that, and then that's what we're doing. I have so many people ask questions about the Bible and conclude that this is the thing that's true, and what it is just a repeat of Darby or Luther or Calvin. Because why? They heard it in the pulpit, they forgot that they heard it, and now they're trying to come up with an answer to their questions, and of course, what are they going to hear? What they heard from the pulpit. Now, is this a condemnation of pastors? Nope. They were cloned. The philosophy was cloned. They thought they were going to what? To a divine calling, giving them an opportunity to learn about the scripture or learn about the Bible and then go and give it to other people because their heart is that they want to be a pastor. But they're going to a college that's cloning the philosophy of the empire. And don't think for a second that it has anything to do with the political agenda. It has to do with an entire system of control, a matrix, if you will. And so, yeah, you need to learn the ancient languages. You need to learn ancient pictographic Hebrew. You need to learn the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle. Because what Abraham did was counted as righteousness. His walk, his life was an example to everyone. Isaac's and Jacob's life were an example to other one. That's why he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why did it stop at Jacob? Because that's the last time the philosophy was honored. By the time they got to Egypt and did their weird stuff with Joseph, they had already disconnected from cloning the philosophy of their father. And the intrigue is in the fact that Abraham cloned it while he was a Gentile and a magician and a magi. So he's a Gentile, he's a magi, so he's uncircumcised, he's a magi, and he's exiled from Nimrod's kingdom. So he's also a nomad. Yahweh gives him his philosophy. He clones his philosophy. He clones his rabbi's philosophy, right? Because what's a rabbi? A rabbi is just somebody who's increased in knowledge. The word rava is the Hebrew word to increase, right? So rabbi is somebody who is increased in knowledge. So why do we want to learn from them? Because they're the ones who took the time to study, to learn, to understand. So he learns from his rabbi, who? Yahweh. And then what? Or El Shaddai, as he may have called him. And then what? Now he teaches it to what? 70 souls. We know that when they left Haran to come to the promised land, that he actually was already cloning. He was cloning the philosophy, bringing it in, and now all of a sudden he had this following, and the following that was coming in was actually the people who did not agree with the philosophy of the nations. They were removed from the dominant culture of their time. What's the dominant culture of our time? Imperial control. You say, wait a minute, no, we're in America. We don't have imperial control. The heck you don't. You are propagating the philosophy of Augustine, a Catholic priest. Okay? So, when you begin to understand this better, when you start to look into the philosophies, the lifestyles, the behavior of our Messiah, of Paul, Paul is sitting there in Tros, I believe it is, and says, I got to get on this boat, y'all. Why? Because I need to be in Jerusalem for this feast. Why? Because I'm commanded to. What's Paul doing going to a feast? You say, oh, he was a Jew. And what was Luke doing writing about it? He was going to Jerusalem for the feast. Okay. And so here is the concept that I'm trying to get across to you. What you think you understand about evangelism, you don't. And perhaps maybe we'll carry this over to next week. I don't know. I don't prepare my messages. And truth be told, up until 7 o'clock this morning, I wasn't sure if I had a message this week. But once it came, and it was real. And I thought to myself, I'm going to get myself shot preaching this kind of stuff. But I can tell you, in the grand scheme of things, y'all need to know it. You need to know that this has been a psyop from 300 something AD. And it's actually imperative that you also realize that in all of that process, and it might have been 600s, I don't know, but in all this process, it is not your rabbi. And it is not, you have not cloned anybody for him by saving them. You say, well, what is salvation is? That's for another discussion. But I can tell you what it's not. It's not from hell, because hell doesn't exist. Hell never exists in the philosophy of the ancients. Hell never exists in the philosophy of people of Yeshua's time. In fact, one of the worst violations that I find in the New Testament is when Peter says that the spirits are in Tartarus. This is an example of where the Greek has just gone wild with its manipulations. When I say that a translator has a translational bias, or a translator has mistakenly misunderstood what was said, I'm not going to say that they're just flat out malevolent. but that a translator has made a mistake. Tartarus is a Greek pantheon, philosophy, and myth. Why would Peter be repeating it? Here's what the pulpit will say. Oh, well, he's just actually talking about hell. Okay. You know what? I'm done with him. Okay. So when it comes to the importance of this, I want you to think about why you should be controlled by the empire. What's their thinking? So they want you to believe that you can only be saved by them. Saved from what? Saved from hell, right? Second is that you need to make disciples. In fact, I can tell you, if you were to listen over time of all the sermons that you've heard and all of the things that happen during church, there are three things that you would find. Hell is mentioned more than anything else. The afterlife is mentioned more than anything else. Proselytizing is mentioned more than anything else. And no, that's it. So hell, proselytizing, and the need to be propagating that same doctrine, cloning that doctrine. Okay. So when we're working with this thought process, then what you need to do is you need to accept that what do they not actually believe about you? They don't believe that you are capable of A, managing your own wealth, B, having a relationship with God on your own, and C, that they believe that there is absolutely no reason for you to do the work that they supposedly have done. Every theological student goes through the Greek and the Hebrew. It's part of the requirement of almost every seminary. But at the same time, they say, we did the work. We went to college. We went to school, and therefore you can trust me. You can experience religion through me, right? So we sit in the pew and we say, oh, well, I don't need to study Hebrew. I don't need to learn that culture. In fact, even within the confines of the show The Chosen, it's propagated, it's maintained, right? The little things like how the Jewish rabbi was not able to cast out the demon, but Yeshua was, right? The little things like how the Pharisees are doing what they're doing, and his whole thing where he had that woe to you scribes and Pharisees time, and how animated and how angered he was. It's not what that's about. That's midrashic interaction. And you need to understand that Yeshua would not have carried that kind of anger. That anger comes from fear. Okay? But more than anything else, I want you to think about what they do not trust you to do. They don't trust you to govern yourself. They don't trust you. That's why there's all these laws that, I mean, holy smokes, the safety laws for getting a transportation license to have a motor carrier. It's insane. They don't trust you that you're going to drive the right kind of vehicle on the road. It's ridiculous. But the concept is it goes back to control. They want you to stay poor so that you don't interfere with that system. They want you to stay stupid so that you don't interfere with that system. And they want you to stay docile so you don't interfere with that system. You need to wake up. You need to realize that from the beginning of the inception of the Christian religion, which was in 325 AD, they stopped cloning Yeshua. And if they did, then you're not a clone of Yeshua. You're a clone of them. And if you're a clone of them and you're now making disciples, you're cloning an empire-controlled system. Simple as that. So that being the case, we will go ahead and end here, but I want you to really start to question. When you're sitting in the pew, I want you to start to question, where and when did this become a truth in my life and why? And you'll find, just as I did, I was told by the pulpit. You'll find that I was told by a Christian friend who had gone to seminary school. I was told by a pastor this, to believe this or think this. In fact, I was threatened by a pastor because of when I would question things like hell. So become independent of the system and begin to see this control. There's a risk, there's a reason why there's a Christian vote, because people don't think for themselves. Okay. Shabbat Shalom.